So welcome everyone. I'm Felipe Rojas, and I'm happy to introduce Professor Mary Bachvarova, the second speaker invited as part of my class on thunder gods and dragon slayers. Mary obtained her BA from Harvard University and her MA and PhD from the University of Chicago. She was part of the now defunct Committee on the History of Culture, a program in which, as she told my class today, you got to do whatever the hell you wanted. Evidently, she wanted to learn ancient languages and get cool tattoos. And that is what she did. Eventually, she wrote an MA on Sanskrit grammarian taxonomy and a PhD on the Anatolian background of ancient Greek epic. She has co-edited several books, including the very recent Fall of Cities, Commemoration, Literature, Folk Song, and Liturgy. And a few years ago now, Anatolian Interfaces, Hittites, Greeks, and Their Neighbors. Most recently, she published this massive volume entitled From Hittite to Homer. So those of you who are interested in intercultural exchange in the Eastern Mediterranean will know, I am sure, that one extremely thorny issue concerns the exact interconnections, or the nature of the interconnections between Homeric traditions and the literary traditions of Mesopotamia, the Levant, and Anatolia. In the east face of Helicon, the classicist Martin West infamously proposed a hotline going directly between Mesopotamia and the Greek world, bizarrely bypassing Anatolia. In this book, From Hittite to Homer, Professor Bachvarova excavates, as it were, the phone lines and the telephone poles that connected Anatolia and the Aegean, poles whose remains pop up in places like Hattusha and in Delos. One particularly exciting aspect of this book, to me at least, is the vividness with which Mary imagines the festivals and rituals in which myths were performed. And today, for my class, we read about the music and the dance and the drinking and the wine that would have accompanied Hittite and Mycenaean public gatherings. This afternoon, she will talk to us about a slightly different but related topic, cult practice and technological innovation. Please join me in welcoming Mary Bachvarova.
Thank you very much. Am I clear? Am I mic'd? Am I being heard properly? Yes? Okay, great. So this is a chapter from the book that I'm currently working on, where I'm really looking at prayers and how they moved around, their means of transmission and who actually transmits them. So this is a little bit of a bait and switch, because what I'm really interested in, or what started me on this project, was the parallels between Greek and Vedic prayers and trying to explain them. And so I will spend a little bit of time showing you why this is a problem, and then we will go through the Near Eastern material and then come back to this at the end, these parallels again, and how you might explain how they move around. So very famously, Sappho 1 has been compared to Rig Vedic prayers that invoke gods, especially gods that are connected with the sun. Perhaps many of you know, students here, that Aphrodite has elements of the Indo-European dawn goddess attached to her. And you can see here that both invocations focus on the chariot and also on the speed of the steeds who are compared with, or who are birds actually. And this movement across space to the practitioner who is calling the god. So originally, people assumed that the reason why we have these parallels is because they actually come from the common ancestor of Greco-Aryan. The problem here is that actually the chariot that is described here was not invented until long after Greek and Aryan separated. As we now know, our earliest evidence for this spoke-wheeled, horse-drawn chariot comes from the Shintashta culture, which is about 2000 or 2100 BCE. So if any of you are interested in chariots and warfare, you probably know that people have argued for a long time who invented the chariot and who's responsible, and trying to fix it in time has been a very challenging process. But it looks like it starts earlier in the Central Asian steppe and moves down into the Near East, making it all the way to Qanesh by 1800. So this is a problem right? Because therefore, these images and this poetry, the prayers, has to be transmitted in some other more circuitous route. So just to make this clear to you, students who maybe are not familiar with Indo-European, you can see that Greek and Aryan languages, in other words, Indo-Iranian languages, are actually pretty closely related. They separated pretty late. And it is possible to reconstruct a lot of features of this Greco-Aryan culture and its poetry. But when you start finding the same parallels in Hittite, you have to either postulate a much earlier common ancestor or a different means of transmission. So one of our problems will be that we see some of this same material in the Hittite prayers, and how we would explain that is an issue. So this was actually very annoying to Martin West, famous classical philologist who did a lot of work on the prehistory of Greek poetry, on the one hand looking for Near Eastern antecedents, and the other hand looking for Indo-European antecedents. Since his whole goal is to reconstruct this Ur poetry, he found this, quote, a devastating result, right, for us seekers of Indo-European mythology. I actually think this is a really interesting problem. We can actually trace, because we can connect this material, the verbal art, to actually archaeologically attestable concrete objects. We can actually follow it in a way that we can't much other kinds of verbal art. So I'm going to suggest that what we see is a transfer via a very circuitous route of transfer via the Near East through one or more, several different languages, moving through Anatolia and finally reaching Greece. So this is actually, I think, a really important way of dealing with how to reconstruct early kind of cultural history, when you can actually use two strains of evidence, one of which is textual and the other of which is material cultural. You can actually fix much more exactly the transfer and the place, the time and place of transfer. And so looking at this one particular image really, I think, is a good example of how this technique can be really beneficial, and the importance of not just being focused on philology or archaeology, but combining the two. All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to work through some images associated with the sun and horses and wheeled vehicles, and then we're going to look at who actually transmits that. It's another really unusual feature about this particular motif is we can link it very concretely to a specific person, a specific kind of young man. All right, so sun god has a lot of layers of imagery. We can, as it were, do an archaeological excavation of it and layer them temporally. We can suggest, for example, that the earliest imagery we find is the sun god as an eye, right? And then the sun god becomes associated with horses and horse riding, and then the sun god becomes associated with different vehicles, and we can position each of these temporally. And we can actually even concretely narrow down the connection of the sun god and the spoke-wheeled war chariot to Tel Brak around 2000 BC. And at that point, we can argue that these motifs are transmitted through prayers that we can actually see textually to make their way to the Hittites and then finally to the Greeks. So let's start with the earliest stuff. I have this wonderful hat. I don't know if any of you have seen this. This is quite tall. I guess it's about 1 meter tall. And it seems to have been used in solar deity ceremonies coming from Germany. I like this because it seems to show 3 different layers of sun god imagery. We see our eyes, which is that early layer, and then we see the solid wheel, and then we see the spoked wheel. So it's a really nice amalgamation of different temporal layers of sun god imagery. So the sun first becomes associated with the eye, the watching, watchful eye of justice, perhaps in the Neolithic period around 5000 BCE. Now, this isn't actually my argument, but it seems that at this point where we start to have cattle herding, we start to have hierarchical societies, we start to see situations where people might be owing money, having to borrow money and having to take oaths, and that the sun would be actually the guarantor of those oaths. So we can see that this is probably the earliest idea of the sun, and it's not a particularly unusual one. You find this in the Near East too. After that, you start getting the association with horses. So we'll talk a little bit about horse domestication and some of the problems in the evidence before we moved on to the wheeled vehicles. So by the early Neolithic, horses are being eaten in the steppe, in the area between the Ural and the Volga River. So here's our Volga River, and here's the Ural River. And horse heads and lower legs are being placed in human graves. So they already have some kind of cultural significance beyond being meat. And those of you who know anything about Indo-European rituals, there are these weird rituals where you skin the horse and you keep the hooves and the skulls and you kind of display them. It's sort of standing on a pole. You can see this actually in Central Asia today. I saw it on TV, in fact. So it may be that we're already seeing an early version of that ritual. We start seeing horse head maces even before horses really seem to get there up in this area around 4300. And so it seems that horses as a symbolic animal are almost more important than their economic value at this point. Seems to be associated with, well, what do you use maces except for to bash people on the head with? So with sort of violent assertion of hegemony, you could argue. As far as domestication of the horse rather than herding, that really hinges on trying to prove that you can see changes in the horse that show you that they're being ridden or used as traction animals. So that has to do with the bit wear, which is one of the things that David Anthony has done a lot of work on. He actually has broken horses using rope bits and then done dental x-rays on them to show what the characteristic bit wear would be, and then try to connect that with a bit wear with marks on the teeth of horses. And it seems at this point, although many people have argued against this, that there's some good evidence for that. There's certainly evidence for horses being milked and people processing their milk into food by around 4200 BCE. At this point, we might suggest that horses are being associated with swift movement, and in particular because there seems to be a fascination with the colors of horse coats, that different colors of horses are associated maybe with the sun in different phases. So as for wheeled vehicles, they're following a different kind of symbolic trajectory, and eventually the two are going to come together. So what's really interesting about the wheel is that it kind of appears suddenly all over the Eurasian landscape at the same time. And all of our earliest evidence is indirect. It's either in models, we see, or in depictions on cups. Also, we see swales, which are the wagon tracks at Flintbeck, for example. And we also see at Uruk the first depictions in the Near East of what might be wagons. You could argue that these are log rollers instead of wheels here. And so one of the issues is trying to date these relatively and say where the origin of wheeled vehicles comes from. So there are two kind of arguments about that. One is that they start in Uruk and then they move out to the steppe. And the other argument, which I think is starting to win, is that they start in the steppe and they move down into the Near East. And Andrew Chariot is the one who argues for an origin in the Near East, moving northwards through the Caucasian corridor. But now it seems like we have enough evidence that we can date well to argue that really it starts in this area, the Tripolius culture here. And one of the really striking things that people have wondered about for a while is that a lot of these Indo-European words that are connected to wheels and wagons seem to get borrowed into Near Eastern languages, and the best way to explain that would be that Indo-European speakers invented the wheel. I'm not deeply attached to that, but it's an interesting fact. One thing, though, it does seem like the precursors to the wheel we do find in the larger agricultural sort of traction technology here with the toothed roller on the threshing sledge. So the wheel might have started from these other agricultural implements. Our earliest evidence, direct evidence for the wheel, comes from Maikop, which is conveniently located on this corridor where a lot of different cultural features are being transmitted back and forth. And these here are two wheels that are put on top of a wooden cover over a grave. And so, I mean, I guess it's not surprising that the earliest direct evidence is it kind of come from a ceremonial deposition of a wagon. But what we can really see from this and from these cups that wheels and wheeled conveyances have a lot of symbolic value, allowing for both as containers of liquids here, and as ways of moving people or dead people, gods across space and into supernatural zones. So one of the points I want to make is that these things are not always, cultural practices are not always transmitted because they're actually useful, but because they have ceremonial and sort of metaphysical value. So certainly it's true that even before the wheel, we're seeing ceremonial advents on sledges, in fact. So we have an early attestation here of this guy kind of sitting on his sledge being pulled by some kind of bull or oxen. This is a reconstruction of a sledge that is in the famous Ur burials. And we also have descriptions of offerings of these funerary sledges. So sledges already, the movement across space is being presented as a ceremonial feature, and we can actually connect it to archaeologically attested objects. Certainly, we also see wagons as soon as they get invented being featured in ceremonies. So they're transmitting, and particularly the living king and gods. So, for example, we know from the late 3rd millennium tablets from Tel Brak that the ruler of Tel Brak, which is 45 kilometers to its southeast, traveled there ceremoniously with his retinue using chariots drawn by kungas, which are these crosses between donkeys and onagers, and was a particular sort of product of Tel Brak. They were famous for their kungas. Onagers are often portrayed as the traction animal of gods, but my understanding is that they're almost unbreakable. So in actual use, the ones that people used are these mixed breeds with the donkey and the onager. So here we can see again the enactment of this ceremonial procession with an onager probably here, right, or a kunga. And we can see again, here's another chariot representation here. And it looks like here we have our Anzu bird, and we have our 2 lions, and we have our 2 gods here at the front of the chariot, perhaps driving it, and the charioteer and his companion. The earliest attestations you see for the chariot, they seem to be associated, so these are battle carts with solid heavy wheels. They're associated particularly with local storm gods. So at Lagash, Ningirsu is given a special chariot. And I would argue that these heavy, creaky conveyances are particularly appropriate for these thundery storm gods. They represent the destructive power of the approaching storm, and the crushing of the victims under the heavy cart, which is similar to being crushed, the grain being crushed under the tooth roller of the threshing sledge, is an important symbolic feature of these early battle carts, which are not actually that useful. If you can see, they're actually being harnessed through their nose, these equids, right? And which is not the best way to steer. And they don't have a lot of turning capacity. They really are, the main thing you'd be doing with these is running people over with them. And so we can see this in the verbal art associated with the advent of these stormy gods like Ninurta. That he is rumbling like a storm on the horizon. This is the creaking, rumbling chariot. And the chariot itself rumbles and makes a noise. It shimmers like lightning. And again, we see that going on here where the storm god is being drawn by this kind of lion griffin creature. His roaring would be symbolic of the thunder, just like the chariot's groaning and creaking. So that does, and so this, even after we develop the spoked wheel, the heavy, crushing, destructive chariot does remain associated with the storm god, particularly the Syro-Anatolian storm god in the 2nd millennium. So we can see him driving across the backs of these little hunched over mountain gods, for example. And the traction animal changes to a bull, and so again, the roaring is like his thunder. So I do think that the original association is with a stormy kind of god. We do know, though, that the sun god does have a land conveyance quite early. The Gudea cylinder, which also mentions the chariot of the storm god, refers obliquely to the chariot of the sun god by referring to the steeds. Now, what specific kind of animal this is unclear. Nisku just means, the best quality animal. But it must have been well known enough to just obliquely refer to it. And certainly in the first millennium, there are very famous examples of the sun god's chariot, the big one coming from the Hebrew Bible, the chariot of Shamash, which is destroyed in 2 Kings, 2 Kings. So I don't think it's surprising that gods whose features are elements of nature that move across the landscape are going to be particularly attached to land conveyances. So here from the Hassanlu bowl here at the bottom, which comes from Iran, just to the south of Lake Urmia, you can see the 3 gods that have conveyances are the moon god, then the sun god, and then the storm god. So those 3 particular gods that move across the landscape are going to be particularly attached to conveyances. But what we see in the earlier material, that the conveyance most characteristic of the sun god is the boat. And in general, in southern Mesopotamia, which is very marshy, it makes sense that gods are carried by boats. And we have lots of depictions of that here. Here's our little temple, and here comes either a human being carried in the boat, and here's the god kind of sitting on his chair, arriving by boat. And here's our sun god here in his human-headed bison boat. And the boat ends up being sort of circumscribed to the journey of the sun under the earth at night when he's going through the primordial sea. So he will have the chariot for when he's in the upper world, and he'll use a boat when he's in the lower world. As far as the spoke-wheeled war chariot with horses, when it starts being used as a processional vehicle for the sun god. So I'm arguing that that develops in locations where chariots or cars and equids and the sun god were already objects of cult. In the area where there's the earliest evidence in the ancient Near East for the spoke-wheeled chariot and for the horse replacing other traction vehicles. And then it was transferred to other gods. And so this is Tel Brak, in fact. Remember that ceremonial procession that I mentioned earlier, which is depicted here, is coming from Tel Brak to Tel Baydar, in a cart drawn by Kungas. So Tel Brak, in its period of Akkadian hegemony, was an important northern outpost of Mesopotamian civilization. It's overlooking the trade route from the Tigris Valley north towards Anatolia and west towards the Euphrates. It's the source of those expensive kungas that are favored by the Eblaites. And it is a way station on a Pony Express type route in the northern Mesopotamian. So I'm going to get a little bit more into the imagery of the sun and carts that we see at Tel Brak. And also equids. We see that whole donkey skeletons are found buried in the cult precinct as part of a closing ceremony. We have some 191 clay equid figurines that have been recovered from there, including one possible very early example of a horse, as well as 102 clay models of vehicles. We have tripartite solid wheels. We have the crossbar, perhaps. And then we have at least one spoked wheel model. Again, this is a very early example. So while Hurrian is not attested here in this period, it is at Tel Mozan or Urkesh where a horse figurine has been found. And the first horse found so far in the ancient Near East is at nearby Tel Leilan. And it has been suggested by the excavators of Tel Brak that it was the newly arrived Hurrians who brought the horse to Mesopotamia. And we can see that these Hurrians are being influenced by local ideology. The ruler Talpish Atali, whose late 3rd millennium sealing describes him as son of the country of Nagar, seems to be reflecting that local mythology because the sun god is not really important to the Hurrians. And we see also at Tel Brak not just the sun god, but also other elements, not just equids, but other animals associated with the sun god, in particular these human-headed bisons, who are very much associated with the Zagros Mountains. And we see his equid son, Shakan, receiving worship in this area. So there's multiple kind of animals that are associated with the sun that are receiving cult here, or being used as symbols in cult there. It certainly seems that that the sun, because it comes from the east over the Zagros Mountains, becomes associated with animals that are found in the Zagros Mountains, or perhaps cross over the Zagros Mountains, which is exactly where the horse is coming from. So it seems acceptable to assume that even if Hurrians were the intermediaries for the horse in Mesopotamia, that the animal was actually brought originally by Indic speakers. It's not impossible that horses are brought by the Caucasus, will just say, but it is certainly most probable that they came from the east, from beyond the Zagros Mountains. And so, the term that is used for horse, which is donkey of the mountain, would refer to their origin from the east. And we can see the sun very much associated with the east and crossing those Zagros Mountains. He saws his way through the mountains in the morning. The temple doors open on top of the mountains for him. You can see the two gods here are opening the temple doors. So the sun god has very much a strong association of moving from the east over these mountains. And this area is exactly where you start seeing horse technology and also interest in the practices that would cause the development of this two-wheeled spoke-wheeled chariot. So I've already mentioned that Sintashta is where we have the earliest direct evidence for the chariots. Down in this area, we also see early two-wheeled carts, at least solid wheels, but the precursors to a two-wheeled chariot, perhaps. And also already an interest in racing these chariots. As you can see here, you've got these guys in their four-wheeled solid-wheeled cart being pulled by bullocks, racing these guys in their two-wheeled cart being pulled by bullocks. So I'm going to suggest that one of the reasons why we see this drive towards developing the chariot is not because they're actually useful, but because they're great show-off tools for young men in racing and eventually in battle. So what we do know about Indo-Iranian speakers is that they're moving around in this area, the Bactria-Margiana archaeological complex. They're moving down into India, and they're also moving in multiple waves into northern Mesopotamia. So it would make sense that these are the people that are bringing these ideas, practices, and also the technology down into Mesopotamia itself. It was very easy for the Mesopotamians to associate the spoked wheel, to accept the association of the spoked wheel with the sun, because we can already see that they are representing the sun with basically, here we have a star with spokes. The only thing we're missing is the rim, right? And here is our nave, right? And the sign for star, with the sun being the most important one of them, we could argue, is in fact a spoked wheel without a rim. And here we get another representation of the sun here as a cross-barred wheel, basically. So it's very easy, and here again we see very much a wheel-like shape without the rim yet. So it was very easy for the Mesopotamians to accept that association, I would suggest. All right, so now let's talk about what else goes with that, besides the technology and just the idea of carrying gods. What is the verbal art that would go with that would cause the gods to move across space in these vehicles, and who is transmitting that? As I said earlier, we can actually really pinpoint quite exactly who this was, which is really unusual, I think. It is the charioteer himself. And we can see the transfer of this social role to Mesopotamia in the etymology of the name, the term used for charioteer in Akkadian. So it's the Indic word Maria, or young man. Then we have a Hurrian individualizer attached to it, and then it's Akkadianized. So we can see it's transferred from Indic into Hurrian and then into Akkadian. And we can talk a lot about what these young men were up to. They really seem to move on their own in bands without women, right? They're invest in that same term. Maria is used to mean rascal, yes? And they seem to be engaged in raiding parties, collecting booty, yes? And perhaps raiding for wives or trading for wives. So we can actually build up a fair amount of information about these young men. And certainly those of you who know your Hindu mythology will be reminded of Krishna, the charioteer, who is the great advice giver in the Bhagavad Gita. So they seem to have been authorities of verbal art while also engaging in practices that make them kind of intimidating, impressive, worthy of imitation. Other words that are borrowed from Indic into first Hurrian and then often into Akkadian tell you a little bit more about what these guys are up to. Again, another word for man or warrior is borrowed. So these are really guys who are working in warrior bands. It really looks like that. The term for horse trainer is borrowed. And the horse trainer, we actually know a lot about what he is transmitting because we have horse training texts. And they are using Indic terminology. And it really looks like these horse training texts are not for battle. They are not for useful activities. They are for racing. They are for showing off. This is what young men spend their time doing and what other young men wish to do. And it comes from this very interesting analysis by Rowling, where he shows that in this famous Kikuli text from Hattusha, only the odd number turns, right, come from an Indic language, and they have to make up new turns to go, new terminology to go in the opposite direction. So they're only talking about racing out, and then the first turn, right, which is at the terminal post, has a name, and then they return again. So then in order to adapt that racing terminology for battle tactics, you have to add a whole nother set of terminology. So I think that's important to remind ourselves that this is not about usefulness. This is about showing off and prestige. And this is what you want your gods to do as well. Show off and have the most modern and sophisticated conveyances possible. So those of you who know anything about the ancient Near East know that the Mitanni kingdom is where we see very obvious connections between Indic terminology and Hurrian peoples. But this is a pretty late. So what I'm really arguing for is a much earlier layer of Hurrian-mediated Indic knowledge coming in. And in fact, a Tel Leilan, a so far unpublished letter between the king of Tel Leilan and another local Hurrian king, mentions the exchange of these Marianu soldiers, and that dates to around 1700 or 1760. So there is some evidence that even before the Mitanni came along with their famous charioteering techniques, the Hurrians were already intermediaries for this information and in the relevant area. Okay. Another famous thing we know about the Mitanni peoples is that they're borrowing gods, or they're making use of gods that are known from the Indic tradition. And so this would be actually the earliest mention of Indic gods in any text, not actually from India, but from these Mitanni texts. Conveniently for me, that includes the sun god. But what is more interesting to me is these human onomastics where you combine the god's name, Indra or Surya, with the term guest, because we can see that there's not just gods being borrowed, but the practice of invoking gods, welcoming them, and therefore one can suggest prayers that are used to welcome them. So let's look at a couple of these prayers now. There is some evidence for influence on traditional Mesopotamian prayers for this new sun god imagery, in particular the introduction of the horse. So we'll look a little bit at that, the introduction of the horse into traditional prayer phraseology from Mesopotamia. And then we're going to look at some other imagery that can't be explained as transmitted via Mesopotamia. So these are famous texts invoking or referring to the sun god. We have quite a few of them. The earliest start from the Old Babylonian period. And you can see this evolution in the terminology for the animal that is drawing his chariot. The term at first seems to be anshe, which is just kind of an equid. It can actually be made more specific by adding other terms. So it might be better not to translate this as donkey, but just as equid. And these donkeys have scary faces. So maybe it would be better to call them onagers, who have these kind of scary elements, as we know from the Return of Ninurta, where the onagers drawing his chariot are described with a lot of the same kind of scary imagery, the terrible serpent's eyes and so on. Then you see in this bilingual place of Utu prayer the same imagery, but this hesitation over who the heck these equids are. So it says, it's in Sumerian, and then it's also glossed or translated into Akkadian. It says, your donkey, that is your donkey of the mountains. And the same thing is said in Akkadian, this kind of odd way of putting it. Your donkey, that is more specifically the donkey of the mountain. And so I would suggest that this traditional language is being updated, and it kind of is, it's a little difficult for the performers and scribes to get their head around this change that is required once you introduce the horse as the animal pulling the chariot. And most striking to me is this particular example of the way of trying to figure out how to say the name of the equid that is pulling the Enlil's chariot. So usual imagery, his horses are harnessed to the yoke, right? But here it is, Anshe Zizi Me'en, yeah? And then there's a scribal pronunciation guide written underneath it. That is, it's Ishe or Zizi, right? So one of the editors takes Ishe as indicating the pronunciation of Anshe, and this is later attested as the Hurrian word for horse. It's probably borrowed from Old Indic, Sanskrit Ashva. And the second ZZ is a pronunciation guide for ZZ Me'en, which means being ZZ, or CC, meaning swift. Yeah? So this scribe is kind of tangled up and trying to figure out, what is this thing? How do I describe it? How do I tell the reader how to pronounce this word? They're kind of throwing up their hands in despair, or let's say confusion at this change in phraseology. But this is a pretty minute change to the traditional phraseology. So let's look at some other examples now that are going to go beyond the Mesopotamian material. So the tradition of Hittite prayers seems to have been a creation that involves mixing local indigenous magical practices, incantations, with Mesopotamian-inspired imagery to create something that I argue looks a lot like Greek prayer. And the prayers to the sun god are key examples of the Mesopotamian influenced scribal material that the Hittites would access through tablets and then translate into Hittite and then perform orally. So one of the few examples that we can attest, that we can see of movement from the scribal sphere to the oral sphere. And that does seem to be true for some of the imagery that's associated with the sun god. And as you can see, this is pretty much a straight out translation, right, of what we see in the Sumerian prayers, right? Particularly the idea that you draw the sun god closer by sprinkling out food that draws his steeds, right? And then as the steeds eat the food, right, you have the moment to kind of have a conversation with the sun god as he's standing there. So that would be one explanation of how this material gets to the Hittites, through scribal mediaries who are learning Babylonian as a learned language and then are gussying up their local traditions of prayer with these kind of prestigious Mesopotamian-derived motifs. The problem is that these motifs go beyond what we can see attested in the Mesopotamian material. But certainly it's true, you can see, when you look at this very striking parallel between the Hittite material and the Rigvedic material, we can explain as coming from a very circuitous route, right? The idea of strewing the barhis grass, yeah? which is supposed to be a place where you would actually sit on and rest rather than eat. Yeah, but that same image is kind of reworked on the Near Eastern side into food for the horses. But so these very strikingly similar images, yes, we can explain them as following this circuitous route, but is the only route through the Scribal-mediated Mesopotamian prayers? That's our question. So there's a lot more material that goes beyond what we see attached to the sun god that shows up in both the Rig Vedic material and the Hittite material. So in particular, for example, in invocating the come from wherever you are invocation. Are you in the heaven? Are you roaming in the mountains? Have you gone to the enemy land to battle, right? This exact motif shows up in the Rig Veda. If you are in the sky, if you are on earth, or if you are on the mountains, this is looks almost exactly like a translation from Rig Vedic to Hittite or vice versa, right? Or that they would come from a common origin. Now this we know is transmitted via Hurrians to the Hittites. This is, we're quite sure about this because this same phraseology shows up in a magical incantation for a local version of Ishtar, the Ishtar of Nineveh, which we have in Hurrian in Hurrian and then translated into Hittites. And it is exactly this same phraseology. Wherever you are, naming a long list of locations. This actually, you know this prayer, right, Felipe? It goes on for columns listing all these different places, right? Long lists of cities, and it tells you a lot about where the Hittites think the scope of their gods, what the scope of their gods is. But so what I'm going to argue is actually the Mesopotamian connections are a little bit of a red herring. Yes, maybe some of this stuff is coming through the scribal transmission, but there seems to be a difficult to get at, but very lively oral tradition transmitted via the Hurrians to the Hittites that would include a lot of the same stuff that shows up in the Mesopotamian prayers. So we're having at least two routes of transmission, right? It's not one or the other, but one of them is definitely an orally transmitted route, and that is one that seems to that survives after the collapse of the Hittite Empire, the loss of writing. It's this orally transmitted tradition that we happen to have a few glimpses of in the Hittite material that then gets transmitted to the Greeks. And in the same way that you evoke Telepinu, or you evoke Ishtar, the goddess of sexuality, from all these different locations, so Sappho does the same thing for Aphrodite, yes? All the different locations she might be in, Cyprus and Knidos and Syria and so on and so forth. So what I think is most interesting here is that you can actually make visible the processes of transmission and reworking of verbal art across time, space, and linguistic and cultural barriers by focusing on the archaeologically salient items and practices presented in the text as causing the God's movement, A, and B, we can argue that the reason why this stuff gets transmitted is because they cause the God's movement. That's the goal, is to get that famous God to come to your house, so you have to perform in the manner to which the God is accustomed. And that's an important driver of the movement of these prayer motifs around the Near East, and then the reason why they are retained even after the loss of writing in Anatolia, because they still seem to be valuable and useful, and then they reach us through the Greek material. All right, thank you.
We have time for some questions, if there are any.
This deals with sort of a specific topic, not really the topic of your entire talk, but you mentioned the evidence for wear patterns on horse teeth, and then you mentioned that some people dispute that, and I was just curious, how do you evaluate the evidence for that, and why do you think it lands on the side of Anthony's position?
Okay, so Anthony, has been working on this for years, right? And so he published the big book in 2007, right? And so he has some earlier examples of bit wear that are not as good as the one that I'm illustrating here, right? Which is much more of a smoking gun example, so which was published in 2009 in Science, right? So it has to do with these kind of lateral markings on the teeth, which can be caused by other reasons, grinding of the teeth. But this one is particularly clear, and I think it really kind of pushes us over into kind of having to accept that horses are getting bitted in some way at this point. One of the problems with this theory of that horse riding happens before horse as traction animals is that we have no imagery of this, right? So this is Ascoparpolo's argument, right? If we don't see this show up in imagery until pretty late, horse riding, so I agree, it's a problem. If it seems to be culturally important, it should show up in the imagery the way carts do. But I do think that this particular publication is kind of ends the conversation about whether it is possible that horses were being ridden earlier than they were being driven. Yeah? Does that make sense to you? Have you read David Anthony's book?
I have, yeah.
Right, so do you know this article in Science?
No, I haven't.
So it really is helpful, I think, yeah, to look at that.
I was actually convinced by it, but I
Yeah.
know
That other people...
I was just wondering how you weighed that.
Yeah, so I was happy to find this article. The other factor was, in fact, that we know that they're horse lipid proteins, right? So we know they're getting milked, which means they got to be calm enough to do that. And those of you who ride, once you get a horse calm enough to milk, the next thing you do is get on its back. I don't really see why it's so puzzling that they would ride them, but anyway, I don't know.
I could ask you something. So you trace very carefully the archaeological and material evidence for the sort of movement of the horse into eastern Anatolia, and you stop there and you didn't trace very carefully the continuous movement onto Greece, and so or at least of the mythology, and I was wondering whether you could speak briefly about how you imagine from there to Sappho.
Okay, so there's two problems. A, when did the Greeks get to Greece? Do you have an opinion on that? Because hell if I want to make that argument, right? Right, so do you think they get there around 2300? Greek speakers get to Greece around then? It would be helpful. Right, exactly. And that comes from a single archaeological. Anyone here better informed than me on this topic? It comes from a single archaeological site, and it's what seems to be a cultural break around 2300 BC, right? That's supposed to be the advent of Greek speakers to Greece, right? If they are getting there that early, then they're not coming with the chariot. If you want to go with the later date, which is that when you start seeing Mycenaean civilization, that is the evidence of the arrival of Mycenaeans, then they could have brought the chariot with them. So one of the things I'm doing is decoupling the movement of the chariot to Greece, because we have these crucial problems, right, from the verbal art, which we can trace quite exactly. Yeah? Does that make sense to you? That once it gets to the Hurrians and becomes locked into prayers, that's when I transfer from the technology to the verbal art, and I trace the verbal art. Not only because there are problems on the Greek side in trying to pinpoint temporally when Greeks get there, but because I'm sure that's a route of transmission. Yeah? That doesn't mean that it could not have been transmitted any other way. That's the one thing I want to make clear over and over again. When I argue for a specific route of transmission, it doesn't mean that all the other ones are absolutely wrong, right? Sometimes they are, but the real point is that I can show you this one route. I can pull out one thread from the tangled mass, right?
Other questions?
John?
Thanks, Mary. It sounds like you have two threads in the end that you pulled out of the tangled mass. And one is the Scribal thread that I gather runs through southern Mesopotamia. Is that how you see the transmission originally?
I guess, so the Hittites seem to have a couple of different ways they access the Scribal tradition. There's an earlier period that might be directly from Babylon, when they actually sack Babylon. The way to get on the world stage is to sack Babylon, right? So they took their turn on that. And then there looks like there's a later Hurrian-mediated phase, and that becomes more complicated because the Hurrians are also transmitting their own verbal art at the same time that's Mesopotamian-derived, and that's what becomes hairy. Yeah, trying to tease that out.
I had the second part was about the oral transmission, and what geographical route, if different from the Scribal tradition, you thought it might have followed? Or did they follow across the Caucasian land bridge the same way?
You mean the verbal art?
Yes.
So are you saying, I know that Hurrians come from the Caucasus, and I'm suggesting that possibly they're bringing chariot motifs with them from the Caucasus and not just through Mesopotamia.
Yes, I'm wondering if you see a separate route of transmission for the oral and the scribal tradition, or whether geographically they follow, whether chronologically at the same point or not, they follow the same path.
Okay, so I am in the camp that wants the Hurrians to come down before 2000 BC into this area. So they could not have been bringing that particular, they are bringing other verbal art motifs, particularly with epic, that then also show up in Mesopotamia and make it all very confusing, or make it more interesting. Particularly the battles with the snake and all the volcanic imagery, we're seeing it coming from Mesopotamia and also coming from the Caucasus, and then kind of mingling again. So there are things that you can make that argument that is coming via the Caucasus as well as via Mesopotamia, but this one I don't think you can because of the dating of the technology. It's so nice when you can do that. Yeah, it's really nice.
Do we have other questions? If not, let's thank Mary again and maybe have some beverages.